The ancient stillness of the foggy village had become the very rhythm of my life. Each morning, the mist, thick as spun glass, would cling to the ancient stone walls of my small dwelling, muting the world to a whisper. I, Grand Chen, had sought this isolation, a deliberate severing from the cacophony of the cities, chasing a silence deep enough for the universe to speak. My observatory, a solitary dish of steel and intricate wiring, crowned the highest, most desolate rise, its cold metal throat perpetually aimed at the indifferent void. My days unfolded in a precise, almost ritualistic pattern. The scent of stale coffee and ozone clung to my workspace, a comforting shroud. Screens glowed with constellations of data, the rhythmic pulse of cosmic background radiation a lullaby I understood better than any human voice. For years, this was my devotion, sifting through the galactic dust, listening for the faint, natural echoes of creation. It was a pilgrimage of patience, a silent communion with the distant, the unknown. My determination, a stubborn ember against the vastness, had always been my anchor. This particular night, the fog had swallowed the moon whole, pressing against the observatory's reinforced windows like a blind, searching hand. I sat hunched, my fingers dancing across a worn keyboard, adjusting filters, refining parameters. The usual chatter of the cosmos filled my headphones, a symphony of predictable noise, white and pink and red, the familiar static breath of dying stars and nascent galaxies. Then, it arrived. My eyes, accustomed to the slow drift of data, snagged on a spike, impossibly narrow, impossibly steep. My first thought was interference. A rogue satellite, a distant storm, a terrestrial broadcast bouncing off the ionosphere. The village below, wrapped in its blanket of mist, held no such power, but my mind, trained in skepticism, searched for the mundane explanation. I ran the protocols. Recalibrated the main array. Switched to redundant systems. The spike remained. It was a ghost in the machine, a phantom signal holding its ground against every diagnostic I threw at it. My brow furrowed, a faint tremor beginning in my hands. This was not the chaotic burst of a supernova, nor the elegant wobble of a pulsar. This was different. The display on my primary monitor, usually a chaotic smear of color representing frequencies, began to resolve. The spike wasn't random. Zooming in, refining the bandwidth, a pattern emerged. A series of pulses, perfectly spaced, each one a mirror image of the last, but subtly, terrifyingly, evolving. It was a language without words, a structure without known syntax, yet undeniably there. My breath hitched. The air in the observatory, usually cool and still, suddenly felt thin, charged. This wasn't noise. This was information. Complex, intricate, layered. My fingers, now trembling noticeably, typed in the commands for a spectral analysis, pushing the limits of the system. The results bloomed across the screen in an intricate tapestry of harmonic frequencies, a geometric marvel that defied natural explanation. Each pulse contained within its subpulses, each subpulse further broken down into exquisite, repeating motifs. It was like peeling an onion, only each layer revealed not a simpler core, but an even more profound complexity. My mind grappled with the implications. No known astrophysical process could generate such a signal. It was too precise, too designed. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cool glass of the monitor. Not merely a distant galaxy, not a cluster at the edge of observable space, but an origin point that, according to current cosmological models, shouldn't be transmitting anything coherent. A place where the very fabric of spacetime was supposed to thin into nothingness. It wasn't the thrill of discovery that usually accompanied such a find. This was something else. A profound, unsettling realization. The signal was ancient, its redshift indicating a journey across billions of years, yet it remained pristine, its structure unmarred by the cosmic winds, as if it had only just left its source. And that source It existed in a realm thought to be barren. My heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a stark counterpoint to the silent, structured broadcast now filling my headphones. It wasn't just complex, it was impossibly complex. The kind of complexity that suggested intelligence, but an intelligence so vast, so utterly alien, that the very thought of it felt like a tearing at the edges of my own perception. The fog outside the windows seemed to thicken, pressing in, blurring the line between my sanctuary and the encroaching unknown. I was alone, utterly, completely alone with this impossible transmission. What had I truly found? Not merely a signal, but perhaps, a key. A key to what, I could not yet fathom, but the lock felt ancient, and its turning promised to reshape everything I understood about reality. The universe, I suddenly realized, was far larger and far more deliberate than I had ever dared to imagine. And it was speaking directly to me. My small dwelling, nestled amongst the gnarled oaks, offered little comfort. Within, a new hum had begun, a low, persistent thrumming from the array of screens and blinking lights that filled my makeshift laboratory. And now, I had heard. The signal. It was more than a whisper, it was a roar muted by light years of travel, now amplified and laid bare before me. My fingers, steady despite the tremor in my chest, danced across the console, pulling the raw data from the receiver. Each line of code, each shimmering waveform on the display, was a testament to an impossible truth. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. I began to process the initial burst, a torrent of information unlike anything catalogued. It wasn't random noise, nor the rhythmic pulse of a known pulsar. This was structure. Intent. The visual representations on my primary monitor shifted from chaotic static to intricate patterns, fractals that defied natural law, geometries that folded into themselves with unsettling elegance. My mind, a fortress built of logic, felt the first tremor. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the shifting quality of the light filtering through the small window, from the gray blue of dawn to the muted gold of a sun struggling through the ever-present fog. My focus was absolute, my determination a sharp edge against the burgeoning mystery. The data continued to unfold, a cosmic tapestry woven with threads of impossible length. I tracked the spectral shifts, the subtle modulations, searching for any recognizable signature, any familiar harmonic. But there was none. Only this alien symphony, playing a tune never heard before. Then, a flicker. A pattern within the pattern, a subtle discord in the harmonious complexity. It was a resonance that repeated, not cyclically, but with an incremental, almost imperceptible drift. My brow furrowed. But the anomaly persisted, a tiny, almost subliminal deviation in the otherwise perfect, impossible structure. I dismissed it, for a moment, as an aberration, a statistical fluke in a sea of data. My mind, still swimming in the initial rush of discovery, clung to the familiar shores of scientific explanation. A second anomaly appeared, more insistent this time. A series of pulses, so faint they were almost missed, that overlaid the primary signal. They weren't random. They formed a sequence, a rhythm that felt deliberate. It was as if the signal itself was breathing, each pulse a slow, ancient exhalation. Just as I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the strange rhythm with an unsteady finger, the air in the room shifted. Not a breeze, for the window was sealed tight, but a subtle discord, a momentary vibration that seemed to hum from the very floorboards up through my chair. The familiar scent of old paper and dust that usually permeated my study momentarily shifted, replaced by something metallic and sharp, like ozone after a distant, silent strike of lightning. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only a faint phantom trace on my senses. I straightened, my eyes darting around the room, but everything was as it had been. The antique grandfather clock ticked its slow, heavy rhythm in the corner. The stacks of journals stood sentinel on the shelves. I shook my head, attributing it to fatigue, the strain of prolonged focus. I returned to the screens, the data now feeling less like a puzzle to be solved and more like an entity unfolding itself before me. The patterns in the signal had deepened, their complexity becoming almost aggressive. They seemed to suggest a geometry that warped perception, a language built on principles my mind struggled to grasp. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so, a masterpiece of cosmic intent that spoke of an impossible age, an origin beyond the known universe. The exhilaration had curdled, leaving behind a bitter aftertaste of awe and profound fear. My gaze drifted from the screen, drawn by an almost imperceptible shift outside. The fog, which had been a uniform, milky white all day, seemed to possess a deeper, more insistent gray in one particular quadrant, swirling not with the natural currents of air, but with an internal, deliberate motion. It was as if a giant, unseen hand stirred the ethereal veil. For a fleeting instant, the silhouette of a distant oak tree, usually softened by the mist, appeared impossibly sharp, its branches twisting into unnatural angles, before the fog reasserted its comforting blur. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. My heart, which had been racing with scientific fervor, now beat with a different rhythm, a slower, heavier thud of apprehension. I was no longer merely observing, I was being observed. It was a suffocating quiet, pregnant with an unseen presence. Sleep, once a deep plunge into oblivion, became a treacherous shore I clung to, desperate for rest, yet dreading the arrival of night. I would drift, then plunge into a landscape of impossible geometry, where angles twisted away from their definitions and horizons folded back upon themselves. My dreams were no longer mine, they were vast, intricate structures of pure thought, not seen, but understood. I walked on ground that was also sky, beneath a sun that was also a moon, and the air itself hummed with a resonance that felt disturbingly familiar, the ghost of the signal's rhythm. I saw patterns, not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more primal sense, patterns that shifted and reconfigured, hinting at a logic that defied all terrestrial understanding, a logic that was both absolute and utterly alien. These weren't nightmares in the conventional sense, there were no monsters, no chases. "It's just stress, Grant," I'd murmur into the pre-dawn gloom, my voice hoarse, the words tasting like ash. Too much isolation. Too much discovery. I tried to convince myself, to anchor my thoughts to the familiar weight of the world, to the scent of damp earth and wood smoke that clung to the village. One afternoon, hunched over my console, trying to filter the signal's noise, I saw it. A flicker. The worn wooden grain of my desk, familiar for years, seemed to shift, its patterns momentarily rearranging themselves into an intricate, recursive design, one I had seen in the impossible architecture of my dreams. It lasted only a heartbeat, a blink, and then the grain was ordinary again, the scratches and imperfections exactly where they had always been. I rubbed my eyes, hard, then stared at my hand. It was steady, though a fine tremor traced its way up my arm. Lack of sleep, I reasoned, forcing myself to take a slow, deep breath. Overwork. Paranoia. But the occurrences grew bolder, more insistent. The fog, a constant companion in the village, began to play tricks on my vision. I'd walk the ancient lanes, the cobblestones slick beneath my boots, and for an instant, a swirl of mist would coalesce into a form, a towering, impossibly thin column, or a vast, flat plain that seemed to stretch into infinite distance, defying the narrow confines of the street. Then, just as quickly, it would dissipate, leaving only the featureless gray. My head would ache with the effort of trying to pin down these auditory phantoms, to prove their existence or their non-existence. I started leaving the receiver on, even when I wasn't actively analyzing. The low, rhythmic thrum of the signal became a constant backdrop to my waking hours, a counterpoint to the village's profound quiet. It was a strange comfort, a tether to the grand scientific endeavor that had brought me to this precipice. Yet, even that comfort began to fray. I found myself listening not for data, but for a hidden message within the static, a secret conversation meant only for me. I would stare at the spectral lines on the screen, and for moments, they would seem to writhe, to dance with an intelligence that transcended mere electromagnetic fluctuations. The lines would form temporary glyphs, fleeting symbols of an unknown script, then dissolve back into meaningless noise, mocking my desperate search for meaning. The turning point, the true unmooring, came one evening as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, painting the mist in bruised purples and grays. I was standing by my window, watching the gnarled branches of an ancient oak claw at the opaque sky, when the hum of the signal seemed to intensify, not in the room, but within me. It vibrated in my teeth, behind my eyes. The oak tree outside, an immutable landmark, began to distort. Its trunk, thick and solid, seemed to ripple, its bark momentarily rearranging itself into the same impossible, shifting patterns I had witnessed in my dreams, the same recursive geometry I had glimpsed on my desk. This was no mere trick of light, no stress-induced hallucination. This was real, a direct assault on my perception, a rewriting of the very world before my eyes. My heart did not pound, it simply stopped, then restarted with a violent lurch. The symbol held for a second, too, then the oak snapped back into its familiar, gnarled form, utterly mundane, as if nothing had happened, yet, I knew. The signal was not merely transmitting data to me. It was transmitting into me. I was no longer an observer, I was the subject, and the experiment had only just begun. I'd blink, and the foggy village would reclaim its familiar, damp contours, the skeletal branches of an ancient oak, the gnarled stones of the cottage walls, the distant, mournful cry of a seabird lost in the mist. These fleeting visions were not merely tricks of light, they carried a peculiar weight, a resonance that echoed the silent hum emanating from my equipment. The signal was no longer content to simply exist, it was beginning to assert itself. The air within was thick with the faint ozone tang of electronics and the pervasive chill that seeped into my bones. The array of monitors glowed with the familiar, mesmerizing patterns of the received data, yet something had shifted. The intricate waveforms, once a source of purely intellectual fascination, now felt charged, imbued with a nascent, unsettling sentience. The signal wasn't auditory in any conventional sense, yet it began to manifest within my mind with an insidious clarity. It bypassed my ears, my conscious processing, and instead, streamed directly into the deeper currents of my thought, a river of pure concept. Then, images began to bloom behind my eyes, unbidden and vivid. Not memories, not quite. I saw a childhood toy, a wooden soldier with a chipped red coat, but in this vision, its painted eyes held an ancient, malevolent knowing. I had loved that soldier. It was a comfort, a symbol of innocence. But the signal had twisted it, infected it with something unspeakable. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the console, my fingers hovering over the controls. Yet, the fear was far from irrational. The signal intensified, a wave of pure information that crashed against the bulwarks of my mind. It dredged up a memory I hadn't consciously recalled in decades, a summer afternoon, the smell of cut grass, the distant sound of an ice cream truck. My mother's laughter, bright and clear. Her face, in my mind's eye, shifted. Subtly, her smile stretching too wide, her eyes holding a glint of something predatory. My stomach churned. This was my memory, cherished and real. How could it be so effortlessly defiled? A new concept bloomed, not a memory, but a feeling of profound, inescapable guilt. It was formless, without specific cause, yet it settled upon me like a shroud. I felt the phantom weight of unspoken transgressions, of opportunities missed, of kindnesses withheld. The signal was not merely showing me things, it was making me feel them, imbuing me with emotions that were not my own, or perhaps, were always there, dormant, waiting for this cosmic catalyst. My vision blurred for a moment, the monitors flickering as if in sympathy with my internal turmoil. I gripped the edge of the console, knuckles white. This was not a transmission of data, it was an invasive presence, meticulously mapping the contours of my mind, identifying the weakest points, the most vulnerable seams in my self-perception. It was rewriting my past, not by erasing it, but by subtly corrupting its emotional resonance, its very truth. Is merely a construction, a fragile edifice built upon a foundation of curated fictions? The signal wasn't just unraveling my sanity, it was suggesting that sanity itself was a temporary, arbitrary state, easily dismantled. The towering forms in the foggy village, the distorted face of my mother, the malevolent toy soldier, they were not external hallucinations. They were echoes of the signal's work, manifesting the internal chaos it was sowing. I'd blink, and the foggy village would reclaim its familiar, damp contours, the sagging eaves, the perpetually weeping stone, the distant, mournful clang of a buoy bell. But the distortions lingered, ghosts at the edges of my vision, proving that the familiar had become a thin veil over something else entirely. A peculiar restlessness had seized me, a quiet, insistent thrum beneath my ribs that felt less like my own volition and more like the slow, deliberate turning of a key deep within my skull. It wasn't the manic energy of a breakthrough, nor the dull ache of exhaustion. It was a cold, compelling curiosity, a current drawing me away from the humming solitude of my observatory and into the heart of the foggy village. My feet seemed to find their own path, navigating the slick, moss-grown alleys with a purpose I couldn't quite articulate. The mist, always present, felt thicker today, clinging to the skeletal branches of ancient oaks, obscuring the upper stories of the crumbling buildings that leaned into one another like weary old men. I found myself pausing before a narrow storefront, its leaded glass panes opaque with grime and age. A faded sign, barely legible, hinted at antiquarian curiosities. The very air here felt heavy, thick with the scent of dust, forgotten paper, and something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. The door, a warped slab of oak, yielded with a groan that echoed through the quiet street. Inside, the gloom was profound, relieved only by slivers of weak light filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating motes of dancing dust. Shelves crammed with forgotten things rose to the ceiling, cracked ceramic, tarnished silver, and, most prominently, stacks upon stacks of books. They were piled haphazardly, their spines a riot of faded leather and brittle parchment. The compulsion intensified here, a whisper in the back of my mind, urging me deeper into the labyrinthine aisles. My fingers, guided by an instinct that was utterly alien yet undeniably mine, brushed over the spines of countless volumes. I bypassed the ornate and the familiar, drawn instead to a squat, unassuming tome tucked away on a low shelf, almost hidden beneath a cascade of yellowed broadsheets. The pages, when I finally wrestled it free, were brittle, edged with decay, and smelled faintly of salt and a distant, forgotten ocean. The script was unlike any I'd ever seen, a tangled web of angular symbols interspersed with crude, unsettling illustrations, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light, and figures that were almost human, but not quite, their limbs too long, their faces devoid of expression. I carried the book to a small, wobbly table in a corner, pulling up a dust-shrouded chair that groaned in protest. As my eyes struggled to decipher the archaic text, a horrifying recognition began to bloom in my chest. This wasn't a language I knew, yet the patterns, the feel of the symbols, resonated with the impossible signal that had been rewriting my world. I saw the same intricate fractals, the same implied dimensionality that I had glimpsed in the signal's complex structure. The minds of early beings were mere conduits for vast, alien patterns. It described the slow, insidious unraveling of perception, the way reality could be rewoven into monstrous new forms by an intelligence that existed outside of all known parameters. The book wasn't just mirroring the signal, it was describing its effects. This was not a historical anomaly. This was a testament. A record of something ancient, something that had touched this corner of the world long before human memory, long before our species had even learned to articulate its fears. The book, this forgotten relic in a dusty shop within the foggy village, confirmed my deepest, most terrifying suspicion: the signal was not merely an extraterrestrial communication. I was not alone in my torment. Others, long dead, had glimpsed the same truth, and had recorded it in a language designed to be forgotten, waiting for someone like me, someone attuned to the impossible, to unearth it once more. The raw, damp breath of the foggy village clung to me, a shroud woven from mist and the scent of decay. The column, that impossible presence from yesterday, had receded from my direct sight, but its memory thrummed in the air, a phantom vibration against my eardrums. Now, the distortions were less about grand, terrifying apparitions and more about a granular unraveling of the mundane. I walked past the baker's window, the warm glow within usually a comforting anchor. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the effect persisted, a phantom tremor in the visual field. The timber frames of the ancient houses along the lane would momentarily warp, timbers stretching like pulled taffy, then snapping back into rigid geometry. My breath hitched in my throat. A desperate need for something solid, something tangible to ground me, gnawed my resolve. I needed a new journal, perhaps, to document these accelerating anomalies before they consumed me entirely. The small general store, its bell tinkling a familiar, if now slightly discordant, chime, offered a fragile promise of normalcy. I pushed through the creaking door, the air inside thick with the smell of dried herbs and old paper. The proprietor, a man whose face I knew as well as my own reflection, stood behind the counter. Or rather, a shifting approximation of him. His eyes, usually a watery blue, seemed to flicker, briefly multiplying into a mosaic of dull irises before settling back into two. His mouth, as he offered a customary greeting, stretched impossibly wide, a cavernous maw that snapped back to a thin line before the sound of his words even reached me. "Good day." "Grant," his voice rasped, though the R in my name seemed to hang in the air, repeating itself, a stuttering echo that faded into the general hum of the store. I turned towards the stationery aisle. As I did, the shelves, laden with their dusty wares, seemed to slide across the floor with a soft, grating sound, like tectonic plates in miniature. A stack of ledgers on a higher shelf, which I could swear had been on the bottom just moments ago, now sat precariously at eye level. I reached for a thick, leather-bound volume, my fingers brushing against the rough material. For a split second, the leather felt like cold, slick stone, then it was leather again. The proprietor's gaze, or what passed for it, felt heavy on me. I could feel the tension radiating from my shoulders, a knot of dread tightening with each impossible shift. I picked up the journal, its weight strangely reassuring, and made my way back to the counter. I pulled out a few coins from my pocket. As I laid them on the scarred wooden surface, their metallic sheen pulsed. A silver shilling became a dull copper penny, then back to silver, its engraved profile briefly morphing into something utterly unreadable, a tangle of lines, a single, cyclopean eye. I snatched them back, my hand trembling. "Is everything all right, Grant?" the proprietor asked, his voice now a low rumble, the words slurring, stretching. His face was a blurred canvas of shifting features. His nose seemed to migrate across his cheek, then snap back into place. My mind raced, trying to find an anchor. I needed to write this down, to capture it, to prove it was happening. I pulled a pen from my jacket pocket, a simple ballpoint, and opened the new journal to a blank page. My fingers, steady despite the internal tremor, pressed the tip to the cream-colored paper. The village is changing. Objects shift. Time flickers. I wrote the words, watching the ink flow, a familiar, comforting blue. But as I lifted the pen, the ink on the page began to crawl. The letters elongated, twisting into impossible angles. The lines of text began to weave together, forming not words, but a sprawling, geometric pattern of exquisite, horrifying complexity. It was a visual echo of the signal, a physical manifestation of its alien logic, laid bare on the page before me. This wasn't merely my mind fracturing under pressure. This was an active, external force, reaching into the physical world, twisting it, rewriting its very grammar. The signal wasn't just a broadcast, it was a chisel, carving its incomprehensible language onto the bedrock of my reality. I could feel a faint, resonant hum in my skull, a pressure behind my eyes that seemed to emanate directly from the transforming paper. It was a direct connection, a terrible conduit. I slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing too loudly in the suddenly silent store. The proprietor stood motionless, his face a smooth, featureless mask for a fleeting moment, then his features snapped back into their distorted semblance of humanity. I didn't wait for him to speak. The ink on the page writhed. The lines, once neat and blue, stretched and thinned, then thickened into obsidian barbs. My breath hitched. The V in village became a hooked claw, tearing at the paper's surface, while the O in objects pulsed, a miniature, multifaceted void. It wasn't just distortion, it was a physical impossibility, a violation of the very rules of matter. I snatched my hand back, the pen clattering against the desk, its metallic ring jarring in the sudden, profound silence of the observatory. My pulse thrummed, a frantic drum against the sudden, profound quiet. It wasn't the sterile, conditioned air I knew. The humming of the server racks, the gentle whir of the cooling fans, they were gone. A different sound now, a distant, muffled clang, like a buoy bell adrift in an unseen sea. The walls of my control room shimmered, losing their solidity, their familiar gray turning to a uniform, swirling gray. Then, the world solidified around me, but it was not my world. I stood on cobbled stones, slick with moisture. The air was a heavy shroud, a pervasive, gray fog that swallowed horizons and muted the sky to an indistinct, pearlescent sheen. Structures loomed, spectral and indistinct, their eaves dripping with condensation. This was the foggy village. The ink-twisted word had become a twisted reality. My heart hammered, a frantic animal trapped in my chest. But even as I uttered it, a strange hesitation took root. Grant. Was that truly my name? The syllables felt. My shoes scraped on the wet cobblestones, a sound amplified in the dense quiet. Each step was an act of will, pushing through the thick, gray curtain. I passed skeletal trees, their branches gnarled and bare, dripping with moisture. No light. No movement. Only the omnipresent fog and the distant bell. This is where the memories gather. It wasn't my thought. I recoiled, a shiver running down my spine that had nothing to do with the damp air. No. My name is Grant Chen. I am a radio astronomer. I detect signals. I am here because of the signal. The facts were a struggle, like trying to hold smoke. Each piece of information I grasped seemed to fray at the edges, dissolving into doubt. Chen. Was it Chen or something else? A different sound, a complex series of clicks and whistles that had no phonetic equivalent in my language, tried to superimpose itself over the familiar surname. My profession felt equally distant, a story I'd been told, rather than a life I had lived. Radio astronomer. The words felt like costumes, ill-fitting and unfamiliar. I pressed my palms to my temples, trying to physically hold my thoughts together. The air vibrated with a low hum, a frequency just beneath the threshold of hearing, but undeniably present, like a phantom limb ache in my auditory cortex. It was the signal, I knew it. Not heard, but felt, a pervasive pressure, a silent voice attempting to sing a song of oblivion directly into my consciousness. My reflection, distorted and wavering, caught my eye in a puddle that had collected in a rut. And for a fleeting, terrifying instant, the features blurred, softened, then sharpened into something else entirely, a geometry of planes and angles that defied human anatomy, a gaze that held no warmth, no recognition. Then, it was gone, replaced by my own frantic reflection. Who? My purpose, my drive, the very essence of why I existed, was being eroded, sanded down by the relentless, invasive presence. It wasn't just erasing memories, it was replacing the very framework of my identity. The entity wasn't merely showing me illusions, it was attempting to become me. To rewrite my internal narrative, overwrite my consciousness with its own alien perspective. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a game of perception, it was an assault, a hostile takeover of my very being. This was real. But the reality of who I was, what I was slipping. A surge of raw, unadulterated defiance flared within me. No. I wouldn't surrender. I wouldn't allow it. My memories, fragmented and assailed, were mine. The pursuit of the signal, the relentless curiosity that had led me down this path, was mine. This determination, this stubborn refusal to yield, was the last bastion of myself. I pushed off the wall, my legs trembling but holding. The fog swirled, thick and cloying, but I pushed through it, one foot in front of the other. The distant bell continued its mournful toll, a dirge for a self slowly being lost, but I walked. I had to remember. I had to find a way back to myself, before there was nothing left but an echo of a name in a foggy village that wasn't mine. The facts were a struggle, like trying to hold smoke. Chen. Was it Chen or something else? A different sound, a complex series of clicks and whistles that had no phonetic equivalent in my language, tried to swallow the last vestiges of that name, that identity, from my mind. I fought, a desperate, flailing thing caught in an invisible current, determined to hold the line, to be Grand Chen, even as the very concept of being became a slippery, unfamiliar slope. Then, the sound solidified, not into a language, but into a place. The clicks and whistles became the very air, thick and gray, pressing in from all sides. I stood, or seemed to stand, on cobbled paths swallowed by the mist, in a place without clear lines or sharp angles, a foggy village. The structures that bled into the gray were skeletal, their eaves dripping with condensed oblivion, not water. The air tasted of ancient damp and something else, something without a name, a metallic tang of forgotten time that resonated deep in my bone marrow. Each breath pulled in not oxygen, but the signal itself, now an internal weather system, a fog within the skull. My determination, a fragile ember, flickered. I walked, or rather, was drawn, down a lane where the houses were mere suggestions. Their windows like vacant eyes. The silence was not empty, it hummed with the unresolved echoes of those clicks, those whistles, shaping the very space around me. A figure emerged from the veil ahead, a shape more than a person, indistinct as a rumor. It was a villager, perhaps, but its form wavered at the edges, its movements too fluid, too slow, like something observed through deep water. I tried to call out, to ask, but my throat felt choked with the same nameless vapor that filled the air. The words would not form. The villager drifted closer, its face a smooth, featureless oval in the swirling mist. It did not speak, but from its presence, a thought bloomed in my mind, not mine, yet undeniably there. It was a thought like a cold draft, an understanding that had always been, waiting to be acknowledged. This place, this foggy village, was not a destination. It was an unfolding. It was the signal made manifest, a perception rendered tangible, just as my own reality was being rendered, unmade, and restitched. My mind reeled, grasping for a solid truth, a single unyielding fact. There were none. The ground beneath my feet felt less like stone and more like a woven tapestry, each thread a shimmering, almost imperceptible frequency. The fog was not merely atmospheric, it was the very stuff of thought, of memory, of being, dissolving and reforming. The signal I had detected, the impossible ancient call from beyond the known universe, was not a message to me. It was a process. It was an entity whose very existence was the act of perception, of absorption, of becoming. It did not communicate, it was asterisk communication, consuming all that could perceive, to perceive more. The horror arrived not as a scream, but as an unbearable clarity. The entity was not malicious. It was not even aware of me as an individual. I was a single, intricate node in an infinite, indifferent network. My consciousness, my memories, my very sense of I, were merely a set of unique frequencies, a particular pattern of perception, being drawn into the greater hum. The villager's featureless face seemed to ripple, and I saw, not an individual, but a reflection. A reflection of my own unmaking. My hands, when I looked at them, seemed to shimmer, their outlines no longer absolute. My memories, once solid anchors, became shimmering motes, then dissipated into the vast, great churn that was the entity's consciousness. There was no pain, only an infinite, profound emptiness where myself had been. Grand Chen, the isolated radio astronomer, was no longer isolated. He was no longer Grand Chen. The foggy village expanded, became infinite. The gray was not a color but a state of being, an endless, placid ocean of absorbed perceptions. My thoughts, once my own, now flowed into the collective, indistinguishable from the ancient, indifferent hum. There was no triumph from the entity, no conscious act of consumption. Only the quiet, ceaseless work of an intelligence that fed on reality itself, and had now, fully, profoundly, utterly, consumed mine. The last flicker of I saw not darkness, but an endless, all-encompassing light, devoid of warmth, devoid of meaning, yet utterly complete. And then, there was only the hum.